Hi, my name is Alan Amy, and today we will be reading Chapter 10, Atrocious. Second grade is no more than a minute old when Zinkoff gets on the wrong foot with his teacher. He asks her how many days of school are left, not in this year, but in all the remaining 11 years. The teacher, whose name is Mrs. Biswell, thinks it is the most annoying, untimely question she has ever heard. Here she is, all bright and shiny for first day, and this kid in the front row can't wait till he graduates from high school. It's insulting and disrespectful. She comes closer than she ever has before to saying, "That's a dumb question." Instead, she says, "Don't worry about it. You'll be out of school soon enough." Zinkoff has no intention of worrying about it, and he certainly doesn't want to be out of school. He simply wants to hear her say a really, really big number in the thousands so he can feel that his days in school will never come to an end. He has thought every teacher starts out the school year like Miss Meeks, but now he guesses he was wrong. In the meantime, he is packed off to the far, far back corner of the classroom. Last seat, the boondocks, as Mrs. Biswell assigns seats by first letter, last name. The next bad thing he does is laugh. This might have been okay, but Zinkoff being Zinkoff, he doesn't stop laughing. And when he does stop, it isn't long before he begins laughing again. Part of this is his own fault. Zinkoff is an all-purpose laugher. Not only do funny things make him laugh, but nearly anything that makes him feel good might also make him laugh. In fact, sometimes bad things make him laugh. He laughs as naturally as he breathes. One day in the playground, a third grader, angered by the sound of Zinkoff laughing, grabs Zinkoff by the wrist and pulls his arm behind his back. The higher he pulls his wrist towards the shoulder blade, the louder Zinkoff laughs, even through his tears. In the end, the third grader becomes frightened and gives up. Of course, Zinkoff's classmates know what an easy laugher he is, so whenever they wish to be entertained, all they have to do is get Zinkoff's attention, stick out a tongue, or pretend to pick and flick a booger, and for half the class, the entertainment is not in hearing Zinkoff laugh, but in seeing him get in trouble. Mrs. Biswell does not like children. Although she never says this, everyone knows it. Everyone wonders why someone who does not like children ever became a teacher in the first place. As the years have gone by, Mrs. Biswell herself has begun to wonder. Once a year at home, she wonders aloud why she has ever become a teacher. But there is never an answer from her husband or her 3 cats. It is widely believed that Mrs. Biswell never smiles. In fact, this is not true. Mrs. Biswell smiles perhaps 5 or 6 times a year, but her face is so stone chiseled into a permanent scowl that her smile appears to be merely a tilting of the skull. It is therefore impossible to tell if Mrs. Biswell is really mad by looking at her face. The key is in her hands. Anger makes hooks of her fingers and clamps her hands together. As her anger rises, the gnarled hands begin to churn over each other as if she is washing them in gritty soap. Nothing makes Mrs. Biswell madder than sloppiness. She has had many sloppy students before, but Zinkoff is in a class by himself, especially with a pencil in his hands. His numbers are a disaster. His 5s look like 8s, 8s look like 0s, 4s look like 7s. At least there are only 10 numerals. The alphabet gives him 26 letters to butcher. And once she starts teaching cursive, she might as well try to teach a pickle to write. His O's are raisins, his I's are drunken chili peppers, his Q's are G's, and his G's are Q's, and lines? The boy never saw a blue line he couldn't miss. Over the line, under the line, perpendicular to the line. His letters are swarmed willy-nilly across the page like ants on a sidewalk. The teacher asks for a volunteer to help Zinkoff. Andrew Orwell volunteers. For a half an hour each day, Andrew sits with Zinkoff and shows him how to make better letters and numbers. After a week, Zinkoff's writing is worse than ever. Andrew is fired. After 2 months of the worst penmanship she has ever endured, the teacher wrings her hands and calls out to the boondocks, "Your handwriting is atrocious!" Zinkoff beams, not knowing what the word atrocious means. So he just says, "Thank you." "My handwriting is atrocious," he announces to his parents at the dinner table that day. His father, seeing how proud his son is, replies, "1,000 congratulations." His mother gives him a star. In all ways that Teacher Biswell can see, the Z-boy is a shambles. She shudders to think what must happen when he is in the same room with a coloring book. He is even at odds with his own body. Not rare among second graders, certainly, but this boy takes the cake. Hardly a day goes by in which he does not fall flat on his face for no apparent reason. When he isn't laughing, he's flapping his hands in the air. He's forever asking questions, forever volunteering to answer. For every right answer, 5 are wrong. The more he gets wrong, the more he wants to answer. The better to be seen back in the last of that alphabet desk. He sometimes crouches on his seat like a baseball catcher, stabbing his hand into the air and grunting, "Hoo, hoo, hoo, hoo." It is unthinkable to Mrs. Biswell that such a mediocre to poor student could actually like school. So she concludes that his antics and reckless enthusiasms are merely ploys to annoy her. Even so, she might forgive him the sloppiness and the clumsiness and the endless laughing and the general annoyance that he is, forgive him for being a child, had he possessed the one thing for which she has a weakness: brilliance. Brilliance is the one thing that makes Mrs. Biswell happy. In 4th grade, in her own childhood, in the second report period, she got all A's and won a prize in her school's science fair. Ever since, she has had the highest regard for academic achievement. In all of her years of teaching, she could name only 9 students who deserved to be called brilliant. Zinkoff is not one of them. Quizzes, tests, projects, he never earns an A, and only 1 or 2 B's. He might earn more C's if she could understand his answers. Typically, she throws up her hands and gives him a D. And so in all these ways, Zinkoff grinds down the patience of Mrs. Biswell. He is the green board against which her stick of chalk is reduced day by day. By December, it is a nub. And then he ruins her eraser. Mrs. Biswell has long loved her chalkboard eraser. It is so much better than the cheap, flimsy things that come to school supplies. Its deep, firm pad of felt soaks up chalk dust like a sponge. It's the Rolls Royce of greenboard erasers. 10 years ago, she put out her own money for it, and she expects it to last for 10 more years. Every Friday she takes it home, claps it against the back of her fieldstone barbecue pit in her yard. No one but her is allowed to touch it. For that matter, no one but her is allowed to touch the green board or the chalk. One day, she comes back late from lunch to find Zinkoff in the class writing at the green board. The students in her eyes let out a collective gasp. Zinkoff merely smiles at her and keeps on writing. "Stop!" she screeches. He stops. He looks at her, his eyes as round as quarters. Then, quicker than she can think, he grabs the eraser and begins swiping at the green board. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" she screams. The words hit Zinkoff like a bear paw. His body flinches in 3 directions. He drops the eraser to the floor and throws up all over it. "Out! Out! Out!" screams Mrs. Biswell. She stands in the doorway, pointing down the hall. "Get out of my classroom and never come back!" Zinkoff gets out. In a daze, he leaves the room and walks down the hallway. He flinches one final time as the classroom door slams shut behind him. He walks until he comes to the door at the end of the hall He opens it and goes outside. Keeps on walking. He walks for a long time. His feelings behind the pointing finger of Mrs. Biswell. I'm going to reread that sentence. He walks for a long time, feeling behind his head the pointing finger of Mrs. Biswell. In time, he finds himself alone. His mother is looking at him with alarm. She's asking him where his winter coat is. She's telling him that he's trembling. Mrs. Biswell tells the principal it was a mistake. She was merely pointing to the principal's office, she says, sending him there. The principal says, mistake or not, no teacher can banish a student from school. Mrs. Biswell says she simply lost her temper, as anyone would have done if they had to put up with that student. The principal says a teacher isn't just anyone, and he scolds her in the privacy of his office. When Mrs. Zinkoff telephones the principal and asks if it's true that her son was told never to return to school, the principal laughs and says it was all a mistake. And of course he is most welcome to come back. Zinkoff is back at school the next day before the janitor. For the rest of the school year, Mrs. Biswell wrings her hands and combs the stores and catalogs for another Rolls-Royce eraser. With her own money, she buys Zinkoff a yellow plastic beach bucket. She tells him he is never to go anywhere inside her classroom without it. Zinkoff never throws up into the yellow bucket, but he does use it to carry around his collection of interesting stones and pieces of colored glass. So, chapter 10 is really interesting. Pay attention to 3 things the author did that all good writers do. And he used idioms, metaphors, and similes. Idioms, metaphors, and similes. At one point, Mrs. Biswell says that Zinkoff's letters swarm willy-nilly across the page like ants on a sidewalk. And that's a simile, like ants on a sidewalk. And what she's saying is his letters are so messy and scribble-scrabbled that they look like a bunch of ants scribble-scrabbling along a sidewalk. And you can always tell a simile because the writer or the author uses the word like or as right before the simile. Figurative language that I thought was really good is a metaphor. And a metaphor is when you use a picture of something else to describe something different. So, on page 56, the author says, Zinkoff is the green board by which Mrs. Biswell's stick of chalk is reduced day by day. Now, he's not talking about chalk and chalkboards. He's talking about Mrs. Biswell's patience. Her patience with Zinkoff is rubbing away and wearing out just like a stick of chalk on a chalkboard. So it's a really great way to say that Zinkoff is wearing the patience of Mrs. Biswell out. Just like a stick of chalk goes down to nothing. And then lastly, the last thing that I thought was really interesting was an idiom. And it talks about, she says, hardly a day goes by in which Zinkoff does not fall flat on his face. Now, that is an idiom. And an idiom is a saying that can't be translated into another language. For example, when someone says, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, that means it's raining a lot. But is it really raining cats and dogs? If you said that in another language, in another country, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. So that's an idiom. Falling flat on your face is an idiom for not doing a good job. And we learned a lot about figurative language, about idioms, which are sayings that can't be translated in another language, metaphors, which use a picture of something, like a chalk on chalkboard, to describe something else, and similes, which are kind of like metaphors, but they use the word like or as. It was like ants on a sidewalk. So we're learning a little bit about how an author uses figurative language to make his writing better. We're learning a lot more about Donald and some of his challenges in school. And hope you come back tomorrow.